Welcome to AM Best Audio.
Alberta, Canada is positioning itself to become one of North America's premier captive insurance domiciles, with supporters pointing to a business-friendly regulatory environment, onshore advantages, and growing interest from companies looking for alternative risk financing options. I'm John Weber for Best Review Magazine. Joining us to discuss what's driving Alberta's appeal and what it will take to become a major player in the captive insurance market is Rob Walling, Principal and Consulting Actuary with Pinnacle Actuarial Resources. Rob, as always, great to see you.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, Rob, have you been surprised about the pace of adoption of captive insurance in Alberta?
I've been both surprised and pleased with the pace of the growth in the domicile, but also just the relative smoothness of it. We see a lot of new domiciles that stop and start, and the regulators have trouble figuring out how to regulate captives, or the captive managers go through some growing pains, and we really haven't seen that here. Alberta's been a fairly smooth and steady growth in captive formations.
What advantages does an onshore Alberta domicile offer?
Well, up until the passage of the Alberta captive law, most Canadian businesses that wanted to do a captive were looking offshore. They were looking to Cayman, they were looking to Barbados. There were a number of offshore domiciles that catered to Canadian businesses and tried to make it as easy to do business there as possible. But it's hard to replicate your home domicile. And so for Canadians, I think Alberta is simply offering less frictional cost and the ability to kind of stay in country rather than going offshore.
Rob, what's the regulatory environment like for captives in Alberta?
You know, it really reminds me of some of the U.S. domiciles that are very approachable by businesses and by captive owners. I see a lot of what I'll call negotiating to yes, not approving everything as it comes in, but also not saying flat out no. If they see a captive that is a good business case, that is a good business plan, but elements of it need to be changed, they're working through that with the captive manager and the captive owner and the actuary and the other involved parties to try and create a final product for approval that meets regulatory muster. But they are really very much open to creative ideas and really trying to get that captive to fit the regulatory framework, but get up and running.
So what kind of captives is Alberta mostly attracting, and why?
Initially, just like most new domiciles, the captive owners are in province or in domicile. And so we're seeing a lot of Alberta businesses forming these first wave of captives. They tend to be either single parent captives or pure captives, but we're also seeing limited partnerships forming captives. And finally, we're seeing a fair number of association captives. But one of the really nice things about the Alberta economy is that a number of the industries that are seen in the province, whether it's natural resources or energy or technology or agriculture or tourism, there's a lot of really clever, creative solutions in the captive space for those industries. So, and I think the nature of the Alberta economy is also really contributing to the domicile's success.
Looking ahead 5 years, what will determine whether Alberta becomes a major North American captive domicile?
That continued evolution of their captive law, and everything I've seen and heard shows a lot of willingness and a lot of interest in the government of Alberta to continue to fine-tune the law. I think they'll crack the nut on being able to do group captives better than they're able to do them now. And the regulatory consistency, when we see a captive domicile in the U.S. that we think is going to thrive and it struggles and it sputters, it's usually some regulatory inconsistency or either they were too aggressive in approving captives that they come to regret, or They say no too often, and getting that regulatory balance just right and making sure your captive law is competitive are really 1A and 1B to having a thriving domicile.
Rob, how is Pinnacle Actuarial Resources positioned to work with Alberta captives?
We take new domiciles quite seriously and try and work with either existing captive managers that we've had success with as they grow into a domicile, or new managers that we meet as new domiciles are set up. But we view Canada as a market, as a long-term growth area for us. And so in response to the business activity that we've seen in Alberta, but honestly in Canada more broadly, we've done two things in the last few months. First of all, we formed a subsidiary, Pinnacle Actuarial Resources of Canada, specifically to be our brand, to be our business in Canada. We think it's really important that we have a subsidiary in Canada to address the Alberta captive market, but to address the Canadian insurance market more broadly. The second thing we've done is just last week we announced the acquisition of a Bermuda captive actuarial firm called Ordnance, and a book of Canadian actuarial business from a consultancy called Great Bay Consulting. And so we really feel like having Pinnacle Actuarial Resources of Canada and then bringing this book of Canadian business into Pinnacle Actuarial Resources of Canada is a great way to show that we're really committed to the domicile, we're really committed to the market, and we think it gives us a real springboard and a real foundation for even more growth in Canada.
Rob, as always, thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
Appreciate it. Thanks again.
That was Rob Walling, Principal and Consulting Actuary with Pinnacle Actuarial Resources. And I'm John Weber for Best Review Magazine.
Looking to get the full attention of the insurance industry? We have the platforms that will do just that. Whether it be AM Best TV, AM Best Audio, Best Review Magazine, or Best Day. Find out more by calling AM Best Advertising Sales at 908-439-2200, extension 5399, and have a great day.